Rain traced slow rivers down the tall windows of the Sterling house, as if the house itself were weeping for the things inside it. Arthur Sterling sat in the same deep, moth-eaten velvet chair he had claimed on a spring morning 50 years earlier, a relic of a life measured in ledgers and land deeds. His fingers, vined with age spots, worried the armrest. He watched the drops collect and depart, each one a tiny, private confession. He had money enough to stop the rain from falling on anyone he cared for, and yet everywhere he looked, he found reasons to mistrust the world beyond his glass. "He will not hear us," Mrs. Higgins whispered from the doorway, more a stage direction than compassion. Arthur kept his eyes level with the rain, trained to the fine choreography of guests and the staff who moved around him. Polished shoes, the clink of porcelain, the low murmur of voices that assumed one would not listen. He had always been good at listening. Decades of negotiation taught him how to hear what people tried to hide behind manners. If there was one lesson life had given him harder than any market crash, it was this: the face people show is often not the same as what they are willing to say when they think you can't hear. He had learned to distrust the spoken word because it was too often a currency for transaction rather than truth. So he decided to test it. He told no one why. He told only himself the reasons he would later list to a lawyer, to a niece, to a neighbor who liked to know the news of this house. That he was tired of being taken for granted. That he wanted to know who would speak plainly of him when he could not respond. That the estate, his careful accumulation, every brick and bond, should go to the hands that deserved it. This was the first of many rationales he had devised and replayed until the sound of them dulled. In truth, his motive was a smaller, meaner thing. Grief had calcified into suspicion. He had found his daughter's wedding album in a drawer, not the one she kept when she was a child, but a thin stack of letters from his eldest son asking for loans, favors, introductions, documents that bore no signature of thanks. Samuel, his firstborn, had a way of smiling like a man who only ever needed to smile to be forgiven. Arthur had remembered how forgiving could become a habit in others when you were the one always giving. So Arthur would be deaf for a week. He'd sit in his chair and the house would carry on around him, thinking he did not listen. It was a blunt instrument, cruel, maybe, he admitted, yet he told himself cruelty was the language of truth in a world that had learned to speak in circumspection and claim. Mrs. Higgins folded her hands in apology and then in obedience. Sarah, the maid, the one who had been there longest, made an embarrassed face and adjusted a tray as if the day were somehow its own apology.
Sarah had been a quiet constant, a widow with a narrow smile, a sweep of a hand that could make a dusty mantle seem like a polished mirror. Her son, Leo, 7 years old with a freckled nose and a pocket full of treasures, came and went like weather in the house, expected, tolerated, loved in places that didn't always show it. Arthur watched them. He watched the way Sarah paused too long at the kitchen door, the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear when she thought no eye watched. He listened, secretly, when no one thought he could. If you find yourself already leaning in, if the small betrayals and quiet acts of a week are the kind of thing you want to follow, stay with the story to the end. He made his decision on a Tuesday that smelled like wet tobacco and old paper. He told Mrs. Higgins he was late of hearing. He told Sarah, curtly, not to worry him with noises. He brushed off the question of a doctor's visit with enough irritability that they left the matter alone. He rehearsed the position of a man who did not hear, the slight tilt of the head, the knowing squint that read lips more than words, the polite half-smile that suggested he understood more than he let on. He kept his mouth a thin, controlled line. The week that followed unspooled in small edges. Arthur meant it to be a laboratory of truth, an experiment in the human material of his home. What it revealed would be data for a conclusion he would later record in formal writing. Day 1. The children. His eldest son, Samuel, arrived with the self-assurance of the heir apparent. He carried his appetite for favors in the polite fold of his hand and the practiced sympathy in his voice. "Father," Samuel said, under the false canopy of concern, "we ought to talk about the portfolio. The business could use some liquidity, a strategic infusion, that's all." Arthur watched Samuel shift from topic to topic like a salesman rearranging goods. He watched how the words "for the family" slipped between sentences as currency. When Samuel assumed his father's deafness, he leaned closer and lowered his voice in a way meant to seal confidences. Arthur did not move. He mouthed nothing. He let his son's words hang in the air, heavy and unadorned by the usual flattery. "What if I took over a couple of the properties?" Samuel suggested, the words carrying the soft coercion of a man who had been given things and assumed to be entitled to more. "You could name me executor. I could manage it. I already have ideas, new investments. We could streamline, cut some of the redundancies." Redundancies, in Samuel's language, meant people he did not think worth keeping. In Arthur's, it meant the last patterns of trust. Arthur felt an old sting, the one that had swelled from the slow realization that care could be turned into commerce. He heard his daughter's voice too, a thread of pity in it. Clara, who had once read him poetry, now measured love in practicality.
"Father," she whispered, "you know how hard running estates is. You need someone to carry your legacy. We're here." Legacy. The word clicked against Arthur's teeth. He had once believed legacy to be a thing you built with tenderness, a set of rooms in which people remembered the small, silly parts of you. Now it had become a ledger line, and every ledger line had a margin ready to be skimmed. After they left, Arthur sat very still and felt less like a man listening and more like a man encircled by the result of a life invested in others who had not learned the currency of gratitude. Day 2. The partner. A former business partner came next, slick as a polished shoe. He spoke in numbers and projections, maps of convenience. Arthur listened to how the man reduced loyalty to a quarterly report. "We could consolidate, Arthur. Think of it. Your name on the lead, mine on the operations. The family preserves the brand, I grow it global. Everyone wins." Everyone wins, Arthur thought. Yet anyone can make numbers sing if you quiet the human notes. He noticed how the partner hesitated only when his gaze flicked toward the staff, dismissed, taken for granted, and then swept away as if less human questions belonged to the housekeeping ledger. Day 3. The staff. On this day the house hummed with smaller, gentler energy. A woman from the neighbors came to borrow a kettle. A parish volunteer asked for a donation for food deliveries. There were not always theatrics, Arthur learned. Sometimes truth arrived in the form of simple concern, the kind with no immediate expectation of return. Sarah moved through that morning like someone holding a secret that belonged to another world. Her hands were rough from work. She had the steady economy of deferment in her posture, as if saving small kindnesses for someone else's need was natural. Arthur watched her, the way she lingered at the edge of the living room where light pooled. He thought of the ledger again. Where would someone like Sarah appear? A line item labeled resources staff, perhaps. The index of his life had no room for quiet resilience. That afternoon, an old woman she knew queued outside the gate for bread during the staff's noon break. Sarah carried a loaf to her hand as if carrying water, not dramatic, only necessary. Arthur watched the exchange and felt something like shame. He had always thought wealth purified affection, but perhaps it simply separated it, boxed it into transactions and receipts. Day 4. The storm. The rain came back with the hunger of an atmosphere corrected. It battered the panes and rattled the gutters. The sky gave the house no quarter. It was on this day that Sarah, wet and tired, arrived with Leo pressed close beneath her umbrella like a small, anemic moon. She had gone to town for supplies. The storm had turned the streets into slow rivers.
On the way back, a carriage had shied and thrummed, and someone had laughed at the sight of a woman and her child walking through the water, as if their dampness were a spectacle for one's amusement. She barged in, breathless, apologizing for the mud tracked across the marble. Mrs. Higgins snatched a towel like a reflex, but Arthur raised a hand and made the gesture of someone who could not hear. Sarah's quick, slight wince was the only sign that the pretense had wounded more than Arthur had anticipated. Leo's hair was plastered to his forehead. He clutched a small toy car in his fist, its red paint chipped and dull, a thin seam glued at the side. Nurses' coats and soulless socks of the world had not worn it away. Instead, the toy had become more precious because of its imperfections. Where some children had new things by rote, Leo's treasures bore the thumbprints of repairs and prayers. He watched them with a cold curiosity at first. This was, after all, one more data point. Sarah bowed her head and began to take off Leo's wet shirt, when the boy pulled at the sleeve and looked up at the armchair where Arthur sat. His eyes were already searching like a little sailor's for the shape of a coastline. Arthur wondered why the boy, soaked and shivering, had noticed him at all. Without being told, the child reached for his jacket. He fumbled. The jacket was in his mother's hands, damp and thin. Arthur imagined the child had simply been cold, a normal child's reaction. But then Leo did something he could not understand fully. He stepped forward, slipped his small arms into the jacket he had been supposed to keep, and, with the uncalculated grace of someone who knew small economies, he placed the jacket over Arthur's knees. Arthur felt the fabric, thin, smelling faintly of leftover biscuits and soap, and then felt the change traverse him. The movement held no calculation, no supplication. It was pure, substitute tenderness, an offering of warmth with no accounting of return.
Sarah started to apologize, something about her son and the jacket and not meaning to intrude. She did not finish. Leo turned his head, and the way he looked at Arthur was not one of shame. He looked like a child who had simply done what a child felt was right. It was devastating to watch. Later, when they heard the thunder roll like a distant verdict, Sarah sat by the hearth and fixed the hem of Mrs. Higgins's apron while Leo lined up the small toy cars he had. Among them, the battered one, Fast Eddie as Arthur would later learn the child called it, sat in the middle like a heart. The boy's thumb traced the scuffed paint with a contemplative rhythm. Arthur watched and for the first time in a long while felt a crack in the armor he had built with mistrust. It was not thunder or lightning that made it. It was a child's jacket and a toy car. Day 5. The children return. On the 5th day, Samuel came back.
He did not bother entering. Instead, he paced on the steps and called for Arthur. He spoke as if the house were a boardroom, as if consent might be negotiated in the foyer. "We should talk," he said loud enough that any other ear would have heard. "You can't blow everything up on a whim, Arthur. You need to think of the family." Arthur let his son's words hang in the rain-soaked air and did not answer. He observed Samuel's impatience, the way he spoke as though ownership was a precedent and trust a commodity. It made Arthur think about inheritance not as a legal matter, but as moral mathematics. Day 6. The reaction. By day 6, the staff had begun to move differently around him. Mrs. Higgins spoke softer, Sarah busier than she needed to be. There was an edge of humiliation that Arthur had not considered. He had meant, predictably, to observe. Instead, he realized he had also made those he observed actors in a play they had not consented to. The knowledge sat heavy. In the privacy of night, when the house settled and the carriage of former years felt like a museum exhibit, Arthur found himself replaying moments with the cruel clarity of insomnia. He had heard his son ask for favors. He had watched a partner reduce people to line items. He had listened to the staff give bread and shelter to strangers while barely meeting the obligations of their own wages. The picture was not just black and white. It had shades of shame and grace. He had not expected to be moved by a child's jacket. Day 7. The revelation. The week ended as it began, with rain and with Arthur's small private grief. He did not emerge from his chair to address the house on the final day. He sat and let the parade of visitors shrink into the soft noise of the household, the clink of cups, the exhalation of staff moving about duty. He felt a tenderness now, an ache that had not been there before. He had set out to collect evidence of greed and the absence of gratitude. Instead, he had found evidence of generous lives lived quietly, and he had caught their movements by pretending not to be there. He had felt a pang, an old prayer. What if he had been wrong? It was late when Sarah stood in the doorway with Leo at her ankle. The boy was bundled in dry clothes now, cheeks flushed from a good run. He held the battered red car in one hand, Fast Eddie, and in the other a little bundle wrapped in a napkin. Arthur suspected, with the slow horror of a man who believes himself wrong, that the child had prepared something of his own to give away. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched them with the unaccustomed vigil of someone watching his own heart. Sarah approached like a person about to ask for a favor that would show her in a bad light. "Mr. Sterling," she said, voice small and careful. "This is—" She faltered, then steadied herself. "My boy, he's been such trouble." Not trouble, but— She smiled, embarrassed by the cheapness of her own excuses.
"He lost something at the grocer's, and he says it was his fault. I promised to make it right. He gave them this to make things even. It wasn't much, but—" Her hands folded as if in prayer. Arthur realized then that he had been listening to his staff, to his own house, and had missed the context that mattered. He had let the ledger be the only way he measured a life. He had been counting what he could see and ignoring what he could not. "You gave them the car?" he asked, his voice a little raw from disuse. Leo nodded. "It was mine," he said plainly. "They were sad, so I gave it." The simplicity of the statement, no pretense, no bargain, stung harder than any of Samuel's polished words. Arthur felt an unaccustomed shame, not at being deceived, but at having deceived. He had enacted a test that stripped dignity, and here was a child who had given away the one thing he loved to make another child whole. Arthur had thought his life would be a ledger and his legacy a list. Instead, someone had taught him that legacy could be a story told in the small acts of generosity that no accountant would ever value. That night he could not sleep. He did not wish to continue pretending. The pretense had grown teeth and bitten someone he cared for, a fact that insisted on atonement. He stepped out of the chair and went to the small table where the child's car had been left. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. The paint was worn away near one wheel. Where a child might see a flaw,
Arthur saw history, the place where a thumb had smoothed a dent, where some soft, careful hand had fixed a wheel with thread and hope. A small gold thread of a memory surfaced, how his own father had polished a pocket knife till it shone like a confession. The toy felt absurdly heavy. It was not worth far more than the cost of a night at the opera, and yet it held a kind of wealth that would not appear in any of his account books. He pressed it into his palm and felt the weight of decisions settle in his chest. He called for Mrs. Higgins and Sarah. In the parlor, with the storm still mapping the world outside, Arthur apologized. The apology came out like an old man with new legs, unsure and sincere. He explained, briefly, as if unwilling to varnish the truth, that he had pretended to be deaf to hear what people would say. He admitted it was wrong. He said it was cruel. He said he regretted it. Sarah's face registered shock first, then a slow, guarded relief. "Mr. Sterling," she murmured, I thought I would learn who was honest," he told her, and he tried to find the words he had been saving all his life for a different purpose. "Instead, I learned how little I knew how to measure goodness." Mrs. Higgins watched him with a small, wary compassion. She had the look of someone who has seen apologies before and knows how they are made and how they wear thin if not followed by something real. "What will you do?" Sarah asked.
Arthur had already begun to imagine the old habit of a man who built castles from blueprints. His mind sketched a path forward: make amends, provide for Sarah and Leo in a way that did not humiliate them, perhaps endow a fund, fix the wages, write a note to be placed with the will. The lawyer's voice resonated in the background of his mind, Mr. Henderson, precise as a typewriter's bell, who had always made arithmetic out of feeling. But the thought of changing the will, of taking the instrument he had used all his life to integer the world into fairness, and instead turning it to reparation, terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He imagined the letter he would write, the sharpness of legal language softened by a few human sentences. He imagined his name, once an epithet for success, being attached to something kinder. He had rehearsed rationales for his pretense with the litany of excuses a man of his station kept on hand. None of them would do now. He knew the cost of being late to the truth. It meant a decade, perhaps, of a child's distrust. It meant the house smelled faintly of a test that had humiliated. It meant that if he altered his will, he must do it in a way that was transparent, deliberate, and just. He did not say any of this aloud yet. He only held fast Eddie, the toy, in his hand, and felt a small, querulous warmth. For the first time in months, he lay down in his own bed and did not sleep as much as think. He thought of his children and their easy acquisitions, of the partner who had looked at people like furniture, of Sarah whose hands were cracked with honest labor, and of a small, raw-handed boy who had given away the little red car because it was the right thing to do. He felt like a scraping of a long-buried coin, a small, unexpected urge to make something right. He would call Mr. Henderson in the morning. He would ask about the legalities, a codicil, a rewrite, an estate plan that would include more than tax consequences. He would ask how to leave a gift not only with a $sign, but with an explanation that would not be easily interpreted as charity. He wanted to write where the money would go, yes, but he wanted his reasons, his confession, recorded in a way that would not be lost to the coldness of accounting. When morning came, it arrived in a wet, dim light. Arthur dressed with the awkwardness of a man moving through new intention. He drank his coffee in silence. He rose and walked slowly to the parlor where the staff had gathered for their midday tasks. He called Sarah aside and handed her 2 envelopes. One, a check with a number he had not allowed himself to write with shame for years. The other, a small slip of paper that had 3 words and a signature. For Leo, the paper read. The words were small and felt like an offering. Sarah read the check first, then the paper. Her eyes filled not with joy at the money, but with an unsteady grief.
She tried to refuse, to put the money back, as if the world could simply be reset. Arthur would not allow it. He insisted quietly. He insisted with an old authority that did not sound like domination, but like someone finally answering the call to be responsible. He meant to stop there. He meant to let the action stand as compensation without fanfare. Yet the knowledge of law and public records sat at the back of his mind like a stern clerk tapping his fingers. If he wished to make a lasting change, to ensure that the gift would not be rescinded by a jealous sibling or misinterpreted, he should do it legally. He would call Mr. Henderson. He would ask for a counsel, for a meeting where he could sign something that would survive his death. When he asked Sarah to sit and tell him about the boy, what he really wanted to know was how a child could give so freely. She told him about nights when money was patchwork and faith was the thread, about vouchers and odd jobs, about Leo's small acts of making do. She told him how he had learned to mend things, to be content with the patched and the second hand. She did not whine, she only described. Arthur felt the hum in his chest, a recognition that no material ledger could ever enumerate. Mr. Henderson was efficient, as lawyers often are when confronted with the messy artifacts of human conscience. He listened. He read Arthur's terse apology and the little scrap of paper Arthur wanted to add to the estate, a note that would explain in plain language why he had altered a decade of assumptions. "You must be explicit," Mr. Henderson said, tapping his pen. "You must be clear that this is your intention and that you understand the consequences. We will need witnesses, a codicil, and precise language." Arthur agreed, every step of the heavy climb. He wrote a short paragraph for the lawyer to read. No flowery defenses, only an admission and a reason. The lawyer, as required, offered legal precision. "I can add an explanatory letter to the file," Mr. Henderson suggested. "It will be considered part of your estate documentation. It will stand as your own recorded reasoning." Arthur wanted the explanation to be honest and brief. He did not want to sugarcoat the cruelty of his test, nor the immediate desire to repair it. He wanted it to read like a man who had been wrong and now sought to make amends. He took a pen and wrote, slowly, with a hand that had made many signatures in his life, but never one like this. "To those who will read this after I am gone," he began, and stopped because the line trembled. He continued, not knowing yet if he would sign his name beneath it. He wrote about suspicion, the way it had grown like mold in silence. He wrote about the week he had pretended to be deaf to overhear those closest to him. He wrote about what he had found, both the ugly and the luminous. He wrote that a child named Leo had given his most prized possession to right another child's wrong, and that it was that act which taught him the measure of true wealth. He wrote that he had acted wrongly, and that he intended to change his will accordingly. When he handed the note to Mr. Henderson, the lawyer read it, placed it in his briefcase, and recommended formal steps. "We will need to call witnesses," he said, "and execute an amendment in accordance with the statutes. You understand potential family challenges." Arthur understood. He did not care for fights that might come later. He wanted the decision recorded with the dignity of legal form, and with a human line that would explain why he acted. He felt the strange, private pleasure of someone who had finally spent himself on the right thing. There were murmurs of protest in his house then as news leaked. No surprise in a place where people pointed gossip like a flashlight. Samuel's name came like a cold draft. "You're making a mistake," his son argued, his speech angular with offense. "You can't be serious. This is your estate." "I am serious," Arthur said. He had not said the words with such permanence before. Saying them changed the air in the room, as if a different weather had moved in. For Arthur there was both a sense of lightning and of dread. To change the will was to make a public stance. He would be judged, he would be contested. Yet the moral calculus had shifted. He had been weighed by a 7-year-old's generosity and found wanting. That afternoon he walked back to the parlor where Fast Eddie lay on the rug. He picked it up and pressed his thumb into the worn paint. He thought about small things, how a child's life could pivot on the nature of a small kindness, how a house full of wealth could still lack the warmth of reciprocity. He felt his chest break open in a way he had thought belonged only to tragedy. He would not, he vowed to himself, hide behind silence anymore. He would speak openly about why he had changed course. He would make reparation. He would, he decided, honor not just the spirit but the letter of what he had come to understand. But decisions are not deeds. They live in the fragile present between thought and action. He sat down and tried to compose the words he would say aloud to his family, words that would not sound like scolding or dramatic renunciation, but like a genuine attempt at repair. He practiced them once, twice, in the small grim light of a late afternoon that still smelled of rain. He did not get the tone right. The first time his son laughed at him. The laughter was thin and brittle, like the outside of brittle things. "You can't do this on a whim," Samuel said. "You can't be generous out of guilt." "Then what would you have me do?" Arthur demanded more sharply than he meant to. The sound was ugly to his own ears, the first sign that his old control was fraying under new feeling. "You're being dramatic," Samuel replied. "This is a test. Don't make another mistake." That word, test, was the nail in a coffin Arthur was beginning to dig. He felt suddenly stripped of all the reasons he'd given himself. The phrase echoed in his mind with the simple cruelty of a verdict. He had been cruel in testing them. He recognized that now, and guilt made him clumsy. He had more than money on the line. He had the dignity of the people he loved, and the staff he had used as a scapegoat for his own loneliness. That night he sat by the window while the last rain abated and wrote another letter, not legal, not for Mr. Henderson to file, but for those who lived with him. It was a humble thing, an admission and an invitation. He would invite Sarah and Leo to stay in a cottage behind the estate if they wished. He would pay for Leo's schooling. He would create a small fund for neighborhood needs. He wanted restitution, not paternal gestures. He wanted to listen, openly and without subterfuge, to the people of his house. Some decisions do not need grand ceremonies. They need years of patient smallness. He understood, in a sudden wisdom that had been slow to arrive, that a legacy is not only a ledger. It is a series of daily acts, sometimes invisible, sometimes as blunt as a child's jacket. As he slept, the house sighed. He had not completed the moral accounting. He had only started. He had made his confession and begun to make reparation. The will had not been changed in law. His son had threatened challenge, and old habits do not die overnight. There were still hard conversations to come. There would be tempers, lawsuits maybe, and the shrill air of family disputes. Yet for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt that his ledger could be amended. In the morning, Leo ran up to his window, Fast Eddie clutched in his fist. He tapped at the glass as children do, challenging, open, entirely unself-conscious. Arthur opened the window and let the child climb the sill. He handed him a small coin, nothing much, a token of the day before, and told him, in as clear a voice as he could muster, "Thank you." Leo's grin was immediate, and the whole house seemed to tilt, suddenly less like an exhibit and more like a place where lives met. For Arthur, the moment was both relief and a new beginning. He had not yet altered his will. He had not yet written the legal clause that would redirect his estate. He had, however, been taught something no ledger could list. He went to Mr. Henderson's office that day with a heavy heart and a clear paper. The lawyer read the note and advised on legal formalities. He warned of contests. He advised witnesses, clarity of intention, and the inclusion of a brief explanatory letter to accompany the codicil. Arthur left the office feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because a plan was possible, heavier because a plan invited conflict. When he reached home, Mrs. Higgins sat him down. "We need to be careful," she said, not admonishing so much as grounding.
If you change something, you must be ready. Arthur nodded. He had been ready for bankruptcy in business, for the collapse of markets and reputations, for the temper of other men. He had not been ready to reckon with the truth that he had been cruel to the very people who had deserved better. He began then, not with a dramatic legal act, but with an everyday one. He told Sarah that henceforth there would be a wage increase. He told Mrs. Higgins he wanted the staff to be treated through contracts rather than the vague promises of benevolent employers. He called the parish and asked that a fund be set up in the neighborhood for small emergencies. He asked counsel about establishing an educational trust for Leo. The acts were small and administrative, the kind bureaucracies like to bury in files and calendars. They were also, to Arthur, acts of tribute, tiny day-like repairs to an evening he had once made dark. Yet as he sat in his chair once more, sun finding the pattern of the velvet, he felt the change like a bruise, tender, still aching. He kept touching the small toy car on the table as if it were the proof he needed that his heart had been altered. And then Samuel arrived at the house, not pacing, but with a fury that had no patience for process. "You think you can just alter everything?" he demanded. "You made a game of people's lives for your curiosity." "It was wrong," Arthur said simply. "I know that now." Samuel laughed, the sound tinny against the high rooms. "You know a lot of things now, don't you? But that doesn't mean you get to undo a lifetime's work because you felt guilty." Arthur looked at him, and for the first time in many years found himself unable to cite a defense that would sound honorable. The ledger had, after all, been his language. Now the numbers seemed small. "You will have to contest me in court if you wish," Arthur said, not as a threat, but as a resigned fact. "I am aware this may cause pain." Samuel bristled. "You will ruin the family," he spat, the word family heavy with entitlement. Arthur did not have the words to fix an entitlement that had been taught and passed down like an heirloom. He only had the knowledge of a child who had offered his jacket in a storm and the feeling of being wrong in ways he had not before examined. He let the argument pass. There would be fights, the lawyer had said as much. There would be grievances aired in rooms he would not be able to control. He had, however, started a different currency: humility and direct restitution. That morning his house had become a place where a young boy's generosity could shift the measurement of a lifetime. Arthur went back to his study and opened a ledger, not for accounts, but for names. He wrote down Sarah's name, Leo's name, Mrs. Higgins.
He wrote small notes beside each: increased wages, schooling fund, cottage maintenance. He left a blank space with a heavier line beneath it: will, codicil, formal letter to be recorded.
He would not write the legal language alone. He would have witnesses and counsel. He would be clear and precise, and leave no room for misunderstanding. Outside, the rain had ceased. The sky wore a dull promise. Inside, Arthur turned the small toy car over in his hand and watched the worn wheel. He thought of the week he had been deaf, and how it had taught him to hear. He had not in this week come to any tidy end. He had confessed and begun to repair. He had made choices that would invite contest. He had a long road of formalities and family tempests ahead. The will had not been read. No court had yet been called. What existed now was repentance in motion, a set of small acts that might one day be counted as a legacy. When the day closed, and family voices were wars in miniature no one wanted to watch, Arthur set Fast Eddie on his palm and turned him over as if reading a map. There was still much to be done. He was a man with the means to make restitution and a conscience newly awake. He had promised himself to do both. In the lonely hour before sleep, Arthur sat in his chair and for once did not pretend. He had been wrong in testing those who deserved his respect. He had been wrong in cloaking his heart in trials no one asked for. The child's act had taught him the vital arithmetic of love. Subtraction for someone else's gain was no poverty. It was the truest form of wealth. He let the toy car roll once across his palm and, with a sudden clarity, wrote a single sentence at the top of the blank page where he kept his notes. This house will honor true generosity, not entitlement. He stopped there, not because he had because he had no other language left to speak with those who would survive him. He had spent his life signing checks and affixing seals. Now he wanted ink to hold an apology. Mr. Henderson came the next morning, a precise man in a blue suit, who carried statutes in his head the way other men carried hymn books. They sat at the long table in the study, where ledgers had once been consulted like oracles. Arthur read the codicil aloud, tired vowels steady with new conviction. He asked the lawyer to draft the amendment with exactness: clear beneficiaries, define trusts, the duties of the trustee, the weight of his own explanation attached so no one could claim caprice. You understand this will probably be contested, Mr. Henderson said softly, tapping his pen in the margin. You must be explicit about intent and capacity. I am capable, Arthur said, and the words surprised even him. I am doing this because I was wrong, deliberately wrong. I tested people when I should have trusted. I humiliated the ones who did not deserve it. I want it recorded, my reasons, my remorse, and my wishes. Mr. Henderson nodded and drafted the formal language.
It named Sarah Sterling as beneficiary of a life tenancy in the cottage behind the house. It created the Sterling Community Trust, funded by a portion of the estate with the express purpose of supporting local families, emergency relief, and educational scholarships. It named Leo as the first beneficiary for an educational fund and designated him, when of age, to consult on distributions as a representative of those the fund aimed to serve. It named independent trustees and required annual reporting. It required no spectacle, only accountability. The lawyer asked Arthur if he wanted to include an explanatory letter to be attached to the codicil. Arthur did. With a careful hand, he wrote a short note, not an afterthought, but part of the legal file that would travel with his will. I listened to others for a week, pretending not to hear, thinking I would find truth in silence. What I discovered was the reverse. Truth lived in small acts of kindness, acts I had failed to see. A child who gave his most precious thing taught me the measure of wealth. I am wrong. I make this change because I believe generosity is worth more than entitlement. Let this house and its means serve those who choose to give to others without counting the cost. Arthur Sterling. Mr. Henderson placed the note inside the codicil and explained how it would be recorded. Witnesses would see Arthur sign. He would need 2 witnesses and the usual formalities. Arthur arranged for Mrs. Higgins and Miss Langley, a neighbor of unimpeachable steadiness, to serve. No flourish, just the quiet of paperwork as the last sober act of a man trying to make right. News of the proposed change traveled through the household like a rumor that had been given a body. Samuel heard before he arrived and showed up with the impatience of entitlement. He leaned over the table and asked, voice sharpened into accusation, "You can't do this. You can't throw away a lifetime of order because of a whim." "It is not a whim," Arthur answered. "It is a correction." "You'll ruin the family," Samuel said. "You'll splinter us." Arthur understood the risk. He knew that blood remembers claims, and that law fights as a born thing when called upon.
He had no desire to see his family torn apart, but he could not return to the ledger of his old life. He saw with a clarity acquired at cost that to leave his estate to the cold arithmetic of expectation would be to continue the wrong. Samuel left in a blast of indignation. Voices rose. The household had its own trials then. Letters, petitions, threats muttered over tea. Mr. Henderson advised calm. He prepared the codicil carefully, advised limits on revocation clauses, and scheduled the signing. On the morning of execution, the house wore a particular hush. Sun slanted through the high windows and made the dust in the air look like something holy. Arthur, steady for once, signed the codicil in the presence of witnesses.
Henderson notarized it, and the small legislations of justice were formalized. Sarah would be provided for, Leo's education secured, funds dedicated to the neighborhood, the house to be maintained as a place with a public purpose, should the trustees so determine. The explanatory note was placed in the official packet. Samuel threatened proceedings. He summoned lawyers. There were murmurs of family suits, of betrayal, of accusations that Arthur had been manipulated by sentiment. It took time for tempers to cool, and for law to do what law does, weigh evidence and intention. In court, Arthur's clear written intent and the formalities of execution were decisive. The challenge did not proceed to the spectacle the tabloids promised. It settled, quietly and with legal finality, the way a well-tied knot holds when one stops pulling. Arthur did not revel in victory. The small triumph he felt was not over a childless son, but over his own hard heart. He had changed course and paid the consequence. He had made enemies and mended a few things. He had made a public amends that smelled faintly of repentance. He kept his promise to Sarah in ways that were practical and precise. The wages were increased, contracts were signed to give the staff security, and a cottage was prepared behind the garden with furniture and a small cleared plot of land for a vegetable patch. He established the fund for the neighborhood and set aside an annual amount for emergencies. He met with the parish and gave them a modest endowment for their errands. He took a more unexpected step with Fast Eddie. One evening, after the codicil was official and the household had settled into new, awkward patterns, Arthur asked for Leo to come into the study. The boy had grown in the months since the storm, still freckled, still earnest. Arthur placed the small chipped car on the polished table and took out a tiny metal disc he had been saving from a jeweler's shop, an old-fashioned restoration of something precious. He told Leo, without sermon, that he wanted the toy returned to him, to be kept until he was older. He polished the wheel and had the craftsman fit a small gold pin on one wheel, not for show, but to mark that the car had been seen and honored. "This is yours," Arthur said. "You gave it so someone else would not have to be sad. That was brave. Keep it." Leo looked at the gold, then at Arthur, and smiled in that unstudied way children do when something simple is given back with dignity. He turned the toy over in his hands, feeling the weight of both the little car and the newness of attention. Arthur, who had spent decades protecting and hoarding, learned in that moment not to clutch, but to witness. Years marched as they will. Arthur lived long enough to see some of the changes take root.
He attended the first committee meeting of the Sterling Community Trust from a chair at the head of the room, and watched as neighbors, modest and resolute, presented case after case. A single mother in need of a deposit, a boy seeking a scholarship, an elderly neighbor whose heat had failed. He listened, no longer pretending, and gave instructions in a voice steadier than he had expected. Be fair, be accountable, be small where necessary, and generous where possible. When at last his breath thinned and his steps slowed, he passed with a quietness of one who had tried to do a final right. The reading of his will was not a family drama, but a gathering of those who had been maimed and those who had loved him complicatedly. Mr. Henderson read the codicil aloud in the parlor, the same room where cobwebs and etiquette had once kept secret so many things. He read the formal bequests, the trusts, the conditions. Then he read Arthur's explanatory letter. It fell into the room like a small bell. I listened to others for a week, pretending not to hear, thinking I would find truth in silence. What I discovered was the reverse. Truth lived in small acts of kindness, acts I had failed to see. A child who gave his most precious thing taught me the measure of wealth. I was wrong. I make this change because I believe generosity is worth more than entitlement. Let this house and its means serve those who choose to give to others without counting the cost. Arthur Sterling. Hearing the words, Sarah's hand covered her mouth. Leo, now a young man poised on the edge of his future, stood with Fast Eddie in his pocket, the gold wheel pressing into the fabric as if it were a talisman. Samuel listened, fury softened but not entirely erased, and then left without a speech. For some, inheritance is a ledger. For others, it is a map of values.
The estate executed Arthur's wishes. The cottage became a home for Sarah and her family for as long as she wished. The trust provided scholarships in Arthur's name. The house, no longer simply a private museum of wealth, became a place of community meetings, a room for the evening classes the trust sponsored, and once a month a table where volunteers served soup to neighbors who had fewer means. The staff were given contracts and respect. Mrs. Higgins had a pension. Small acts Arthur had once overlooked were now the currency through which the house spoke to the street. Leo grew into the role that would have been unimagined at 7. He took scholarships, studied with a stubborn